In the meeting room, the man who had a scar on his face placed his hand on the table, turned to his companion, and with a surprised expression mentioned that there was no way there was really a fourth martial saint in the kingdom of the dragon. The other man turned to him and calmly began to converse. The woman interrupted and, with a serious tone, revealed that the supreme martial saint had been gravely injured and fled after being defeated by the new martial saint. There was no doubt about this. The man who wore glasses and had a beard turned to her, extended his hand, and with a curious gaze asked if the new martial saint was stronger than the supreme martial saint. He asked if this time the fight for energy crystals would not have unexpected changes. The leader of them, who had his arms crossed, interrupted, and while looking at the ground, called everyone's attention and said that this matter was going to be discussed later, mentioning that although Zhao Jai had been defeated, he had also used the hidden card given to him by that lord, gravely injuring the new martial saint, whose life or death was now uncertain. The attention of everyone present at the meeting focused on him. They all began observing the hologram and listening attentively without interrupting. The leader of them was a man with a scar on his face. His eyes were shining with confidence. He made it clear that the issue of competition and energy crystals would not be affected by the new martial saint. The woman picked up a tablet, and while several holograms were floating around her, using her finger, she began to navigate through it. Her eyes filled with excitement, and she decided it was time to talk about the new energy crystal deposit. She made a holographic map appear and, pointing to a specific spot with her finger, said that the coordinates were north of the Great Ocean of the Eagle Country. The leader's attention fixed on the map, and his eyes widened in surprise. With a calm demeanor, he asked if it was the correct location. The woman started looking at the leader and with a confident expression replied that the probability of there being an energy crystal deposit was more than 70%. Upon hearing this, a cheerful smile began to spread across the leader's face. Everyone remained silent for several minutes, waiting for the leader's command. After thinking it through, he gave the order to the king's seal from the 1st to the 4th and to the sect seal from the 4th to the 10th to come with him for a moment. The eyes of the man wearing glasses and sporting a beard filled with curiosity. He placed his hand over his chest as a sign of respect and casually asked if he intended to go personally. The leader's attention focused on him, and with a calm demeanor, he was honest, explaining that if it truly was a new deposit of energy crystals, both the martial saints of Dark Star and the Black Magic Society would also go. He revealed that if he himself did not accompany them, they would all simply be doomed to die in vain. The man's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He nodded his head upon seeing how astute and concerned the leader was for everyone's safety. Everyone remained silent, and seeing this, the leader closed his eyes, and noticing that no one else had anything to say, decided to end the meeting. But just then, someone asked him to wait. A man stood up, raised his hand, and with a sincere voice informed the leader that he had something very important to notify him. The attention of everyone in the meeting focused on the man. They were all curious to know what the man wanted to report. The leader opened his eyes and his gaze filled with curiosity. He began to observe the man and gave him permission to speak. The man was a bald old man, who crumpled some papers in his hand, and while his eyes were shining with rage, he began to shout and with a furious expression, denounced the director of the institute, Professor Nepson, for using his name to deduct and extort enormous resources from society for half a year. He revealed an overwhelming fact. The group's flow of funds was already on the verge of completely collapsing. The man crumpled the papers even more forcefully and could not help but clench his teeth tightly due to rage. He was so furious that veins appeared on his face. A man who seemed to be younger than the rest started staring intently at the leader, slammed the table hard, and in an angry tone made it clear that Nepson was a liar since he had told him that he recently had financial difficulties, and that the research would be delayed for 3 months. Another man also joined the conversation. He stood up, and while his eyes were shining with hatred, he slammed the table hard with his hand and revealed that Nepson had promised him this was an investment, swearing that in just half a year, profits could multiply by 10. The bald man clenched the papers even harder. He was very furious and wanted to kill Nepson. All those who were in the room began to talk among themselves, realizing that Nepson's bastard was a liar. They didn't know what to do and knew they were finished since they had lent him a lot of money and resources. The leader and the woman remained silently listening. She closed her eyes and then let out a sigh A few days ago, she had also received news that Nepson's research funds had already been advanced until next year. As if this weren't enough, in this half year alone he had submitted for the 4th time an application to conduct experiments with energy crystals, and the amount requested in his latest application had reached 10 grams. One of the men stood up and turned his back on the others. The other man's eyes were filled with despair and hatred because he had lent all his savings to Nepson. The bald man stood up, placed both hands on the table, and fixed his attention on the leader. He began shouting like a madman, calling Nepson a greedy and cunning demon, comparing him to the devil, saying that not even the devil knew as much about how to tempt people as he did. According to those who had been swindled by Nepson, he was just an ordinary person who hadn't even begun learning martial arts, and yet he could control level 7 and 8 masters at will as if it were nothing. To them, this was absurd, more absurd than the president of Lion Country having diarrhea in public. The leader, although somewhat annoyed, simply closed his eyes and decided not to get involved in this. The woman's eyes filled with suspicion. She called everyone's attention and with a calm expression mentioned that something was not right since Nepson was not a warrior, so there was no way he needed so many funds and resources, swearing that once they got to the bottom of the matter, they would make him pay for it. However, even so, this was difficult for her to understand. With a serene expression, the leader crossed his arms and with a penetrating gaze gave Warner the order to personally go look for Nepson and ensure this matter was investigated clearly. After saying this, he ended the meeting. Warner, the man who wore glasses, placed his hand over his chest, bowed his head before his leader as a sign of respect and promised to fulfill his orders. The bald man's eyes were full of despair. He raised his hand and decided to go with him, and if he didn't get his money back, he swore to skin Nepson alive. Once the meeting came to an end, Warner, with a confident expression, began to leave the room. The other men who had been scammed by Nepson were furious and started following Warner. They decided to all go together to pay Nepson a visit. At the same time, in Nepson's laboratory, the floor was littered with empty containers of spinal fluid. Despite the liquid being expensive, it was even spilled on the ground. In front of the capsule where Lu Sheng was located stood 2 people who used 20 units of level 8 anomalous medullary fluid and 3 units of level 9. They were Nepson and his assistant. While the girl was holding medullary liquid on the shoulder, Professor Nepson was connecting the containers to Lu Sheng's capsule. With a smile, he mentioned that the concentration of genetic optimizer formula number 5 was still lacking, giving her the order to keep adding. At that moment, a heartbeat was heard, and upon hearing it, Nepson's eyes widened in surprise, leaving him paralyzed with shock. Quickly, he pressed his ear to the capsule and his eyes began to shine with joy. With an excited smile, he asked if she had also heard it. He paid attention and realized that the heart of God had begun to beat. The girl, visibly surprised, placed her hand over her chest and her attention fixed on the capsule, causing her jaw to drop. Her eyes widened in surprise, making her put her hand over her mouth. She used to mock in her diary about Professor Nepson's excessive obsession with ancient myths, but she never imagined that the day would actually come to witness history. When Lu Sheng's corpse was discovered, she saw it with her own eyes. Even Professor Nepson's idea of resurrecting Lu Sheng had been ridiculed by countless people. She would have never thought he would actually succeed. Now Nepson was about to revive a dead god. Nepson stuck to Lu Sheng's capsule, and his eyes widened with excitement. He was as happy as a small child seeing candy for the first time. He couldn't help but smile upon seeing that the wonderful god was awakening. Lu Sheng had given him a revelation in a dream, and now only the moment of the true god's arrival remained. His excitement was interrupted by the sound of an alarm. There was a problem in the laboratory. Nepson detached himself from the capsule and took several steps back. With a confused gaze, he couldn't help but wonder what the problem was, while he was trying to understand the situation. At that moment, the girl, visibly scared, started running towards Nepson and with a gaze full of fear revealed that something bad had happened. Their experiment had been discovered and now many people were forcing their way into the laboratory doors. At the same time, several men arrived at the entrance of the laboratory and one of them began to pound on the door. They were furious, ordering Nepson to open it, calling him a coward. He had the guts to steal their money but not to open the door. They knew Nepson was inside and were going to do everything possible to get in. Nepson's expression changed. He turned towards the door and with a serious look called them short-sighted fools, explaining that there was no greater honor than participating in the resurrection plan of the great god. He was not going to let them ruin everything, as only one step remained for success. Lucia clenched her fist, not knowing what to do. Nepson, visibly desperate, panicked, began pointing at the door and ordered Lucia to activate as soon as possible the most advanced defense system of the laboratory to prevent those bastards from entering at all costs. Lucia placed her hands over her chest and with a worried gaze tried to explain to Nepson about the defense system. But Nepson clenched his teeth and with an enraged look said there was no time to lose, urging her to hurry since once the god awakened, everyone would know that he had been right. Lucia arrived at the defense room. In front of her there was a lever and above it there was a warning sign. With her body trembling with fear, she began to walk toward the lever. This was the defense mechanism designed according to the highest standards, so that the experiment personnel would have time to escape in case of an enemy invasion. Even if it meant destroying the evidence, the protective shield could stop a martial master for 5 minutes. She closed her eyes and without hesitating for a second, began to activate the lever. The members of the organization were no longer going to be able to enter unless they sought out the Divine King, Lord Harold. She decided to stop thinking about it since anyway this served to buy some time. Once the lever was activated, a powerful light began to emerge from the door, blinding everyone. Nepson returned to the room where Lu Sheng's body was, started observing the god's body and with an excited smile, gave Lucia the order to use all available resources, including grams of energy crystal. Following the order, Lucia brought several containers and with a gaze full of admiration, nodded her head. Nepson fell to his knees on the ground, and as a faithful believer began to pray. He asked Lu Sheng to wake up at once so that his light would soon illuminate the sky and earth. Our boy, who was inside the capsule, began to absorb the resources with his eyes closed. He was in the dream space and had his fist clenched. In front of him, there was a zombie master with a ponytail on their knees. Lu Sheng didn't even look the zombie in the eyes. He started to use his power and focused, causing green energy to begin emerging from his fist. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, making golden energy appear. He decided it was time to try the method of the 7 mystics of the Founder's Fingers, the technique of the Grand Martial Master of the 7 mystics called Ding Qiayu. Lu Sheng began to concentrate energy in his finger. He was using a Grand Master level technique called Skill of the 7 Mystics, pointing at the stars. After taking another deep breath, Lu Sheng struck the air with his middle finger. This technique was so powerful that a burst of energy emerged from his finger, capable of destroying even the strongest opponent. Lu Sheng opened his eyes and a joyful smile appeared on his face, as killing with a single finger felt incredible. He extended his hand and his body began to emit energy. His attention fixed on the energy, and it didn't take long for him to realize that he had made a breakthrough, and the Grandmaster technique had fused with his body. While his eyes were shining, Ding Qiayu's spirit appeared in front of him. He began to observe it and his eyes filled with joy. She had spent her entire life perfecting this technique, stopping just one step short of perfection. In a sense, her desire was now fulfilled through Lu Sheng, so calling the technique pointing at the stars no longer did it justice. He decided it was better to call it cutting the sky. Lu Sheng summoned a small red flame in his hand. He started observing it and a smile appeared on his face since cutting the sky sounded good. It had style and plenty of class. In these 6 months, he had obtained too much. In the real world, he absorbed resources without limits. And in dreams, he obtained advanced techniques. He had completely defeated all the great masters of martial arts street, accumulating a total of 41 manifestations of martial Tao. In the Wheel of Destiny, he had ignited 98 flames of willpower, achieving absolute perfection in spiritual power. He clenched his fist and his eyes began to shine with confidence since this space no longer had stronger opponents. He had completed the game in its entirety. In front of him, there was an empty alley with everything destroyed. Lu Sheng stretched his legs and stood still. His eyes filled with suspicion as he turned around. He went on alert since in the real world someone was trying to interrupt. He could no longer keep hiding it. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.